This is a special serious play stream for the Connected Learning Summit. We're going to take a look at the game The Stillness of the Wind and talk about Soraya Murray's chapter, oh god, what is it called? Landscape in Games as Ideology, I believe? Something like that, anyway.
Yes.
So, yeah, before we get started, we want to do a quick land acknowledgement, and then we'll get into introducing ourselves and talking about the game. Janelle?
All right. We acknowledge that in Milwaukee, we live and work on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigami, part of North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present.
Awesome. With this really peaceful music, that was really lovely. Okay, so my name is Ryan House. I am a PhD candidate at UWM in Milwaukee. Yeah, we can just go down the line. David, do you want to take it over?
I am David Kutchik. I am a PhD student at UW Milwaukee in English Plant H as well. Ren, you're up next.
Okay, I couldn't tell. Hi, I'm Ren. I am Ren Dalton. I'm a master's student in English at UWM in Plant H as well.
Morgan.
My name is Morgan Forbush. I am a master's student in anthropology.
My name is Janelle Malagong. I'm a PhD student also in Plant H English.
My name is Eric Kirsting. I'm a PhD candidate in English at UW Milwaukee.
Awesome. And together, along with some other folks, we make up Series Play, which is a collective of faculty and graduate students at UWM campus who are interested in studying video games, and play. So today, we're looking at this game, which, is all about land and living on the land. I guess one thing that we should talk about early is that Murray is coming from landscape from a visual studies perspective. She's really interested in the ways that, taking ideas from art studies and film studies and just thinking about how things are represented and what relationships are imbued in those representations. So we'll just start messing around and yeah. I
was just gonna say, yeah, in Soraya Murray's book, which is on video games, the visual politics of race, gender, and space.
Yeah, thanks.
We were looking as a group. We were kind of, rifling through going through the pages of it, and her chapter 3, which is all about landscapes and space in visual culture in games, we thought would pair really well with this game, partially because a lot of what Murray kind of relates it to are landscape paintings, and so she talks a lot about how ideologies surrounding landscape paintings also relate to video games in certain ways. And at least for me, when I just first saw the game itself advertised in the little teaser trailer, right, the first thing you see is kind of this landscape that our main character is in, which is kind of this desert farm landscape. And so I just, before even really digging into either text, I just saw oh, that's probably a connection we could really build upon, is this connection between landscape and games. And particularly game spaces.
Can somebody maybe put a link to the book in our chat?
Already done.
Janelle did it already. Thanks, Janelle. That's awesome.
Got it.
So the game is essentially, just sort of made up of these various tasks around this woman's house. She exists pretty isolated. There's a little bit of story maybe at the beginning that we rushed through. That sort of lets you know that she had a big family, but they moved off. Oh, there's somebody here. Let's go talk to this guy.
Yeah, and so with the Murray book, then, relating it to Talma, who's our main character, and the game, what are people thinking just in terms of like how it's maybe a little bit different or similar to Murray's discussion of landscape paintings?
I think like Murray's discussion of landscape paintings talked about the romanticism of conquering the land, as well as like a lot of the paintings earlier of farms being like we are conquering or we are domesticating wilderness. The farm itself really paints that picture of it. You know, it's dilapidated, but it's quite rustic. It looks really pretty. It kind of reflects that romanticism that you see in landscape paintings a lot.
Yeah, and I think taking that, linking it into Murray's discussion of resource management later, and it's linked to the context that land has specifically within the capacity of the gamic. The resource management in this game is in a lot of ways more tense. It's a lot more interested in the labor practices that are going on, as opposed to something you get in a game like, say, Murray uses Phantom Pain. I would argue maybe something like Civilization is incredibly apt as well, right? Where resource management is a mode of conquest as opposed to being a mode of getting by
Oh no,
or making do.
my game crashed. Hold on. Just a second.
That's what happens. That's
Right
what happens
back.
on streams, though.
It's a live stream. We'll edit this part out. While I'm waiting for this to come back, something that Morgan was sort of talking about, the whole idea of landscape as ideology, she's taking from the study of landscape, right? That's not quite Murray's idea. But she writes about W.J.T. Mitchell's book, Landscape and Power, which apparently is like a really big sort of seminal work in this area. And he writes about landscape as a cultural medium and having two roles. The first is to naturalize cultural and social constructions. And the second is to place people inside those naturalizing processes so that they start to internalize sort of their way of being and in a way sort of their own existence through their relationship to the land. And I think maybe that's a really interesting way to think about Talma here in this. I mean, I actually am really glad that we get to see this again, right? This is the landscape that we're playing on, right? This is our playing field. And we can see that we have an enclosure here, which, I mean, enclosures are obviously quite culturally stuffed with meaning. And we can escape well, I say escape. We can move outside of the enclosure a little bit to go, sort of behind the house or to get water from the well. But we're really sort of, as a player or as this player character, she's really sort of, I don't want to say stuck, but sure, stuck here, right? As a place of settlement and sort of I guess, dwelling, I suppose, if we want to get Heideggerian on it, which maybe we should.
I think to kind of expand on that idea of what the purpose of the landscape painting is, I think one thing that's really interesting about this game and landscape paintings in general is the way that they use color to kind of communicate this, right? So here we've got this kind of idyllic, maybe farm, right? That's part of this natural landscape. And the colors of the farm, they pop out a little bit from the quote unquote natural landscape. Obviously it's a video game, but everything meshes like it's all within one palette, which helps sell that naturalization that this is how it's meant to be, right? That kind of idea of the landscape and situating the player and the man-made things within that place is through that color is not natural, right? It's man-made recreation of the landscape with us fitting in it colorfully perfectly, right?
Yeah, and it's definitely kind of naturalizing the made landscape of making the palette all kind of mesh together and making man-made structures pop out, but also, like you said, get incorporated into the palette of the quote-unquote natural prairie land is very much like this is naturalizing it and creating a this is what it's supposed to look like, sort of feel this man-made environment.
Are you saying like these really bright colors that are clearly man-made, right? Like a roof and whatnot, in contrast stand to naturalize the more subdued colors?
I guess from my perspective, the palette is what I'm interested in. So
okay,
I'm particularly like everything's within this kind of, I don't know this like kind of autumn flavored palette. I'm not very good with colors. I feel like my immediate reaction is to go to Ren. I don't know if Ren knows anything about colors.
A little bit. A little bit.
But Ren, maybe Ren could elaborate on this a little bit more than if you know a little bit more about color theory than I do. But it's everything in this on the screen that I'm looking at fits within like a similar autumn palette. And I think that is an act of naturalization, like of landscape naturalization. Yeah. It has that, one of the WJT quotes in the chapter uses the word dream work of imperialism. And this is dreamlike to me in that way.
Yeah, I think you're getting this from, I would think 3 different places. One, you have an intense, like, warm temperature going on in the field, mixed with a grain effect that's diffusing that light, right? And then on top of that, you have the little green accents on the roof that come out a lot cooler and pop hard, but green itself is kind of a naturalizing color. So you get all these things that come together. It makes it feel diffuse, dreamlike, or at least like you're in some sort of passing haze. And then it's being, you know, even the colors that are accents that are causing you to like the green patch on the back of the character's clothes that helps you locate her in the sea of haze, right? All of these things are there to work as identifiers in you know, generally speaking. And to build on that a little bit more also, that opening establishing shot, right, which is kind of the landscape of the landscape, gives you that blue-pink tone. And you don't see the blue again, but in that establishing shot, you get this kind of visage that has this really nice, what's the word? It's not complementary feel. It all comes together. Nothing's discordant, you know?
Yeah.
Rin, I think what you just said is really interesting, though. You said the landscape of the landscape, right? Like, so that naturalization is already working through that sentence, right? The landscape isn't the land, right? It's the frame through which we view the land. The landscape is the landscape, right? But the way we talk about landscapes is just what we see in front of us, right? That's that naturalization, I think, like in action.
And I definitely think it kind of goes back to the discussion of their discussion of landscape painting and the visual and video games, because, you know, we think of a landscape, we think of, you know, the opening shot of the beautiful blues and pinks, as well as the more nostalgic landscape of a farm and an old lady on a farm, or old person on the farm. And it kind of just, the term landscape is inherently like a cultural one, like she said, as well as a visual one.
Totally. Yeah. I think we're getting really close to talking about Baudrillard and hyperreality, actually. And the idea that, you know, the representation takes over for the thing, or I guess it's more a representation without a real life referent, right? You know, Murray talks about, and I guess, you know, this comes from Mitchell maybe, I think, about landscapes being a second order representation, which kind of goes back to the comment I made about Rin's landscape to landscape. But I think what's really interesting about games, to Morgan's point, is that it's almost one further removed from that, right? Because if we're thinking about how landscape is represented in a video game, it's not quite this, it's code, right? And then code is then represented through what we see. So it's, you know, I don't know if it's a fourth or a third level representation. I don't know if it just adds one or doubles it, you know?
What are the levels?
Something.
I have something. Okay, go ahead, David.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say something I think is interesting, that we were trying to talk about landscape and how it kind of creates this idea of something as a real space, right? It creates the real world in its built environment, right? So what I think is interesting is that you have the houses are like deliberately made to look kind of like, especially the roofs are made to look very patchwork. Right, and I think in a lot of landscapes that Murray is talking about, which were, you know, in the 1800s, late 1800s kind of thing, and then beyond, a lot of landscapes, you know, some of them do have that patchwork, but I'm thinking of specifically, you know, landscapes about farms, and how a lot of them kind of are seen as like, I don't want to say perfect structures, because that's not really a rigorous word, but they're not really dilapidated in the way I see Talma's, you know, farmhouse on this land. And I do think there's this interesting way in which it naturalizes the space and kind of presents the space as a natural, quote unquote, thing as we would see it in the real world, quote unquote. But also by having like the dilapidated roof and these buildings that are like not quite perfect, it also like seems to create the sense of like what a real human in this space also like operates as, and how they like interact with the space. And I just think it's doing this interesting work where by not having like a perfect quote unquote structure, it also shows to the player how like the character associates with that space as a way of like getting by rather than mastery, which is what Murray usually associates with landscapes.
I think maybe talking about mastery would be really useful, right? Because she talks about the ways that particularly Metal Gear Solid 5, and I think we could easily say most sort of mainstream video games utilize their landscapes, or at least sort of represent their landscapes in a use-value way, like a relationship. What can I get out of this? What resources can I get out of this? Can I use this to fulfill my goals or whatever? And I think, this game, I don't know if I can imagine a game that doesn't do that. But to be fair, I have not really tried very hard. So I don't know what ways maybe can we think about that idea playing out in this game.
Well, I think I like the idea that's raised about rules-based space in the Murray, and like engaging, because it also gets into, I think, what Murray, like there are two computational logic threads that run through Murray's work, right? There's the acknowledgement that the game is, generated computationally, right? There's a rasterizing process, so there's a landscape, if you will, that is simpler and allows for the computer to draw in the more complex structures. There's post-processing, right? Which is where we're getting this diffuse light and a bunch of other, effects. So you have these like layers of layers in a painting per se, but layers here going on that's computational. But you also have the computation that the player makes at any given moment. And this gets into resource management again. And the choices you're making here are, I mean, obviously, and to some extent in any survival game, you're making choices to survive. But the choices you're making here are more day-to-day. They're more of you're choosing whether to make cheese or cook eggs, which plants to plant, right? There's a sense that, like, you'll get by every day, but there's still anxiety about, at least in my playthrough personally, I was anxious about every little detail of actually managing to get by, which is something I don't experience in a game like, I don't know, say Ark or, and insert any other survival game.
I think it's interesting to classify this as a survival game. And I don't know if I would have done that, but I don't know if I disagree either. But I really like that idea of the anxiety that you're talking about. The Mel guys
I definitely feel like whenever I played DayZ, I felt that so intensely. That feeling you're describing of every resource being really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wonder almost if there's not some procedural rhetoric here that is sort of getting you to feel that way and making you fail, right? Like, is it possible to make enough cheese to trade for enough goats or hay to keep your goats alive, right? And to really keep that sort of momentum going. Keep these systems moving, because it's a game, right? And we have all of these systems moving, the goats, the milk, the cheese, the trader. Can we keep all of these balls in the air, and for how long?
I think it kind of, I don't know, relating this kind of back to the landscape, there's a very strong passage of time element.
Yes.
And the systems moving around and stuff. But I noticed when you're walking around, you see your footprints.
Yes.
And they're saved day to day. So there's this constant, I walked here yesterday, and it's this constant feeling of retreading where you are. And I think the landscape plays really into that. It saves your footprints. It shows these farms that are worn down. And for me, coming from like going to previously farm areas, farms are always broken down. They're always dilapidated, in my opinion.
In the Midwest.
Yes, in the Midwest. but you kind of see this
in our late capitalist Midwest.
You see this passage of time embodied in rundown fences, and you use your footprints running around, and it's like how much. I love the showing of passage of time based on how you interact with your environment.
I love that you brought up the footprints, right? Because one of the things that Murray talks about is this framework of figure, land, and landscape, right? So we can think about, Palma, the player character, and the player itself, like making some mark on the landscape through their action, right? Which, of course, then would take us to a discussion of space and place, right? Because place comes about through social movement and social action and this kind of activity. Sorry, somebody was about to say something, and I cut you off. Apologies.
What I was going, Janelle, did you say something?
I can go after you. Go ahead.
Nope, you go first. I've been talking enough.
I was just going to say, to follow up with what Morgan was talking about with the footprints, I feel like also kind of touching back what Ren said about kind of managing economy here. I feel like if I was playing this, I'd be so much more concerned with the sort of economy of my movement.
Yeah.
Because it moves so slowly.
Yeah.
Understandably. But there seems to be this kind of like encumbered belaboring of every single step. So that there's not only this kind of like permanent effect on the landscape of your footprints, that reminds you, it's like, I did this yesterday, I did this earlier, do I need to go back? It's almost like a measure of time, certainly, but also of the way that you kind of navigate that space. I think, David, you mentioned something about that earlier.
I really love
that. But I think that all of that kind of together, it sort of does this interesting collapsing of time and space, which I think is really integral to landscapes. They kind of do the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think I was just going to say, I think that's one of the reasons why I see this operating a little differently than how Murray describes some other games working with landscapes, because, Murray mentions, she quotes a James Newton that James Newman, excuse me, a lot of games are about transformation and mastery of geography. And it seems like this is, in a sense, kind of doing the opposite, where, like, the landscape seems so massive and you move so slowly because you are playing as this like old woman who like is isolated. And so like it feels, as at least when I watch people playing it, it feels like the geography is so massive that it's not like calling out to me as a player to colonize it, but rather it like makes me feel very small and tiny within this system, rather than like the person coming in to take over it.
And when you go beyond the fence, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Like it just zooms out indefinitely. I mean, there's probably a limit, but like I didn't find it when I was playing through the game.
Can you just take off and walk?
Yeah, you could just go.
That's really cool.
There's stuff out there a little bit, but not much. Yeah. I think the other thing is that this game, two things. One, its relationship to resource management is in some ways so much more affect-based than other games that I've indulged in.
Talk about that more.
It's about like I value the cheese because of the labor I put into it, not because of the resource that it is. I value the cooking because of the labor I put into it. I value the goats, in a way because I have to take care of them. And these are, things that in a game like that zooms you out and puts you in that top-down perspective. You don't. The feeling isn't as strong for me as a player. Now, other players may have different experiences. They may really value their troops in Civ 6 or whatever, but that's not how I play Civ 6.
So this
on top of that, there's a complication of Disserto's mapping and like walking that's going on with the footprints, right? Where you're not quite mapping the space, but you're not quite just walking through it because your footprints resonate. You never forget where they are. And I think that I don't really know exactly where to go with that thread, but it feels like something that's important, especially when you're reading through the notes. It becomes very clear that the city, the surrounding powers are seeking to expand into this territory.
Right, yeah, I should mention that maybe. Talma keeps getting notes from her family who has moved off into a city, and you know, over the course of time, they start getting a little bit more and more dark, and things aren't awesome in the city for everyone. I suppose. I guess some people are doing okay. Rin said something about, you mentioned, I think it was you, Rin, maybe it was David, but how, you know, when the camera pulls out, it makes you feel sort of alone and very small in the space. Murray talks about that in terms of, so, you know, in straight sort of landscape paintings, that's the sort of feeling that evokes, right? A very small human in the vast sort of expanse. But in terms of video games, particularly, you know, an action game or maybe stealth game too, like Metal Gear Solid 5, having your player character in the center of a wide space actually gives you more power, right? Because you're able to observe more. So you have, I don't know, you feel a little more in control of your surroundings by being able to see more of the land. And I don't know if this game follows that logic, right? I kind of agree with Rin that I think the enclosure does that somewhat, right? We have a very small patch of land that we can do anything with, really. And even in that small patch of land, it zooms in on Talma, and it's like, you know, we see maybe a quarter of it at a time, and it's like, because maybe she moves so slow, like Janelle mentioned, it creates a very, I don't know, maybe a feeling of the, oh, what's the word? When you are looking into, like, a giant sea. Not the
abyss?
absurd. No, not the abyss either.
Yeah.
The sublime.
I think
sublime.
sublime is probably the right word there. I think
it is. Yeah. That's what I was looking for anyway.
It's like being it's like a fear or an overwhelming of the environment.
Right.
I think you're right, Ryan. I think a big reason for this is when you play a game like Metal Gear Solid 5 and you get up into like that high space where you can see more, right? Or Breath of the Wild is a great example of this, right?
Yeah.
Breath of the Wild is you climb like towers and you can see really far.
Yeah.
And that in those games, every action that the player is doing is like very goal oriented, right? But in real life, if you go for a hike or you go up a mountain or you're just in this vast landscape, there's no goals to do, right? There's not a secret shrine puzzle thing to solve and buff your character around some corner. And so in this game, I think maybe better emulates what real life would be like standing in the middle of a field. There's nothing to do. People, you know, like, I don't know. There's a lot of songs about how boring it is to be outstanding in a field. And I think that this kind of replicates that a little bit when we get these zoom outs, right? Because there isn't something hiding behind that mountain range for us to go explore, or some Soviet general to go assassinate in Metal Gear Solid 5, right?
That's so great. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the idea of climbing the tower to see more around you is clearly a staple in video games right now, right? We have like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Breath of the Wild. Like, that's just the thing, right? We want to get up high and see around us, survey the landscape, right? But, you know, like here, yeah, like we don't get that, right? We're sort of stuck in this solitude where we only know what as far as we can see. It's sort of an inverse of that, I suppose. It's a taking away of power by limiting the frame of our landscape. I do like that we have these power lines sort of dotting off into the distance to give the impression that, sure, there's society out there somewhere. These letters are coming from somewhere, but we can't see it. It ain't here, you know?
Yeah, I think Murray mentions that, you know, seeing part of the landscape is by seeing the landscape, you're able to, you know, create the real, right? The big R real. And by creating the real within the landscape, you're able to colonize it and grasp it and take it for yourself. And I think this seems the act of looking in this game, of zooming out and seeing all of the space around Talma, seems to be much less about seeing it, right? Even though it is quote unquote real, right? It's presenting a realistic landscape. It's not about seeing a landscape and seeing everything you can take out of it, but it's kind of about seeing the landscape and how it's in some ways isolating and that's where things get a little more complicated, right? Because you are collecting resources, you are doing some things that can be identified as kind of engaging within that colonialist fantasy in other games. But this game, the way it positions it within the landscape, I think is kind of nuancing it and messing with that a little bit.
Yeah, and Murray talks about, because like we said before, she talks in more visual, represent like film kind of ideas, and she talks a lot about in Phantom Pain how they use camera angles to emulate like the action genre of either TV shows or movies, and how that positions you in like a position of power in a way, be like the way that you are filmed, quote unquote filmed, as like a bystander watching Snake do his thing. It kind of allows you a certain amount of power in a situation or feeling of conquering or mastery. Whereas in this game, the way that the camera angle and the way that the landscape is framed makes me feel a lot less powerful and more insignificant in a way. Because the camera angle is looking down on Palma and it's always coming up into this isometric view of, look at this big farm, and then it zooms out like, look at this giant landscape that you are so small in. So the representation, the showing of the landscape is inherently framing that as you're a small fish in a big pond.
Yeah, it's important to build on that, I think, more than just the bird's eye view, more than just this tracking crane shot, but also this the issue of danger that's present in this, right? Outside of you have a gun. That was one of the first things I noticed playing the game, is there's a literal Chekhov's gun that's just sitting there, and you're waiting for it to have to use it. And you do have to use it. A wolf will come sometimes, and you have to fend him off. Cool. And the other thing is that on the other side of those mountains is the city. Yeah. And it's looming in. And when you zoom out, there's a grave that you can visit and get some additional context from. So loss is out of frame as well. And your family is off doing their own things, and their internal politics is out of frame as well. And so at any given point in time, what is in frame is this bird's eye view crane shot, and what is out of frame is everything that exists beyond the day-to-day struggle of your labor, and you being both unable to grasp with that and functionally having to balance that, the identification that comes with having to balance that.
That's great. I mean, I have a paper idea percolating about off-screen spaces in video games. And I don't know. It's really interesting.
Was Eric gonna say something?
Yeah, I was, but it's okay. We have a lot of people here. I was just going to expand on what Ren was just saying, because I think it's one thing that's interesting to me is imagining the landscape in that context, because I think that's also kind of the way we often live life. I mean, I don't think you could live life thinking of everything all the time, right? Yeah. And so in this way, the camera focuses our thoughts. You got to eat 3 times a day, right? You got to go to the store and get food. Isn't this often the way that we go about living, right? It's just we're zoomed in on what we're doing in any given moment, with the encroaching things of, I don't know, Anthropocene or whatever coming in, only percolating on the edges though. Only when we can get a little away from all the other stuff, right? Zoom out, walk away from the homestead, can we actually notice it and contemplate it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in many ways that encroachment is kind of the, for lack of a better term, the antagonist of the game, if you want to call it that, or an entity, and this is another way that I think it's kind of working with the landscape in an interesting way, is that it's kind of that threat of encroachment, of colonization is always in that background. It's always in the background space. And it's never fully explicitly said hey, colonization is bad in the game, right? But from the letters you're getting, you can tell that life in the city is not this idyllic life. But we also see by working day to day in this kind of dilapidated house that this isn't necessarily all that idyllic either. Yeah. And so it's interesting to see how it's kind of negotiating those spaces of the encroachment of civilization, quote unquote, right, in the form of urbanization, versus a landscape of someone like making do in the desert. It's
I love that
negotiating those two things, and it's hard to figure out. It's definitely taking the standard video game AAA kind of formula and messing with it a little bit.
I definitely think it's interesting. It's kind of like applause to this game and our choice of it, because it's a landscape versus a landscape. The idealized sort of nostalgic farm life that has some flaws in it, as well as the idealized city life that people are gravitating towards in this game, kind of coming and clashing. So it's a war of landscapes in a way.
This game is very modernist to me, right? It's very much about sort of the modernization of big cities and the pastoralization of the rural spaces. And it's very much about that rural urban divide, and I guess that shrinking divide, right?
Yeah, and in some ways it evokes for me the painting the landscape with the fall of Icarus, right? Because in the foreground you have in that painting, which I'll link in the chat.
Yes, please.
A farmer doing his job, and then if you study the painting a little closer, you can see Icarus falling off into the water.
Oh yes, I know that painting. Yeah, that's so good.
It's a phenomenal painting, but two, it in some ways creates this viewer identification issue, right? Well, are you yourself? Are you taking the place of the farmer who is too focused on his work to notice, or is the person Icarus, or simply watching Icarus? And so, in this place, I feel in the background you have that kind of looming tragedy, but the foreground is just day-to-day life. It doesn't affect anybody else, and also, I think this game does a really interesting thing of not embodying capitalism or imperialism. It's a unseen, large-scale force that is abstracted by its implication, as opposed to embodied in a single individual.
Well, I would kind of push a little bit against that, because any man-made landscape that we naturalize into, this is natural, this is nature.
Any landscape is man-made.
Yeah, any landscape that we think is a landscape is man-made.
Right.
Is pastoralized, is kind of that kind of stuff. So maybe
I just mean to say that there's no, there is not an easy fixture for the player to identify as, bad guy that embodies all these things, right? In Phantom Pain, that's not really the same situation. It's very clear the ideological implications of them being, of the the troops that you're fighting being embodied and present for you to kill. Whereas in this, there's no, the forces is suffuse.
Yeah, there's no greedy land owner that's trying, or company that's coming in and trying to buy it from Talma, right? Or
even the wolf, kind of right? We can't really paint the wolf as a bad guy. The wolf's just being a wolf, Yeah. It's just trying to get some food.
Yeah.
Those goats look delicious. Hell, we might eat those goats,
Yeah. I still like the even though there's not a specific antagonist person who's trying to buy our land or something, it's still very much the human forces of colonization and changing of what we feel is best for the landscape. I mean, Thomas Jefferson thought that everyone was going to have a homestead and be a farmer, and that was the best thing ever. Whereas other people, tend towards cities and things. So there's always going to be those cultural forces pushing one way or the other way with landscape.
That is interesting. In terms of the home, right? Because homesteading in the U.S. is so inextricably linked to the elimination of indigenous populations and the killing of indigenous peoples. And I'm not saying that this is what this is engaging with, right? But even in something that seems pastoral and in Talma's case, right, working with the land, making do, maybe having a coexistence with the land and its space in the U.S. in particular, right? That is so tied to extraction of actual people in these spaces as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's just a cultural background to homesteading, where we can say in this game, right, maybe it's advocating for this more intimate connection with the nature, right, or whatever, but it's also playing out in ways that it's not just urbanization that has caused colonization, right? There's also ways in which homesteading also caused colonization.
So
Yeah.
Or was
we're
a
talking
tool
about
of colonization.
Sorry,
You know?
I didn't mean to step over you. I thought you were done.
No, it's okay. Yep, I'm done.
We're using colonization a lot, right? But and I
Yeah.
don't think it's inappropriate here. But I'm curious, I guess, about the concept of dwelling as Heidegger lays it out, and sort of a phenomenological account of living on the land. Is dwelling possible without colonization? Or some bit of imperialism? I mean, like, we can think of enclosures as being somewhat imperialist in colonizing. You're literally carving out a small colony for yourself to live on. But the idea of dwelling is also this sort of give-take relationship. It's very much, he uses a word, a stewardship of the land, right? Where both the land and the people dwelling on it are dependent on each other, right? It's not just a take and that's it relationship. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of, you know, what we're talking about as far as encroaching, I don't know, capitalist and colonizing interests?
I mean, I think contextually, I don't know. I guess it's hard. Sorry, I'm going to go on a slight tangent. I think contextually, though, right, we were talking about like North American landscapes as kind of, right, there are these framing devices for understanding the nature around us, and they're used in like in a colonialist sense to kind of say like no one was on this land, right? It's right. Then I think that's what people were kind of saying. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question,
times, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, we aren't in. This game isn't set in America. We're not in America.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
you know, like how do we reconcile, you know, how do we reconcile dwelling with ideas of colonization and not colonizing? So there's also a missing element of people here, right? So, you know, can you colonize? Well, this is yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't want to ask this question, but
I think Janelle was going to say something.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna answer your initial question, which is that I think that there needs to be a cleaner distinction, I think, between what we mean by colonization and what we mean by dwelling.
Yeah.
Erecting a space does not necessarily mean that it's colonization. Colonization specifically requires the oppression of one force by another force of people.
Yes.
I think that there can be some kind of maybe metaphorical kind of association between taking over land and speaking very specifically of territory, of space, of ground, not of a land contained with people, because that is a very different situation.
Yeah.
I think you can make parallels and associations between those things, but it gets really, really dangerous to start to make very clear lines between them without defining those distinctions first.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Janelle. That was well put, and that was sort of the idea that I was trying to get at. But I'm also sort of curious maybe about, you know, dwelling and I don't know, imperialization and capital, because to me, you know, the enclosures that we have on this farm seem to, well, they order things, right? And not only things but activities and my behavior as a player, or Talma's behavior as a player character. You go to, for instance, the cheese making house to make cheese, right? You don't make cheese anywhere else but the cheese making house. Yeah, I don't know.
Something I think is interesting and that Murray talks about that I think is kind of related to this is she talks about how the gameplay loops of a game can not only model systems of like ethics and that kind of thing, but also like what is appropriate in that space to do. And I think something about dwelling that's interesting that Janelle brought up about like working with the land, right? Or being part of it rather than extracting from it. What's interesting is that the game, like, I believe if you as Talma just like wander off, like nothing really happens in the game. Like there is no progress that gets made besides like time going forward. And like you'll probably run out of resources if you just decide to like do whatever you want and just run off, right? Like you need to work with your goats and your chickens in order to survive and make it through the game. And I think that the way it has you navigate the space then like really prioritizes that kind of like relationship between those animals. Excuse me. And like, so like you have to be intimate. Oh my gosh. You have to be like intimately close with the animals, right? You have to be with them every day. And that that ethics system of being close and working with the animals and working with the land rather than just extracting from it, I think is part of it as well.
And to be honest, you know, maybe this is a question for Ryan. Does the game have a failure state? Or does it just kind of
see it? I think I'm about to run out of food, honestly. But I mean, you know, man. I'm pretty new to this version of the game, but I've played where the goats are, which is sort of a first stab at this game. It's a much smaller scoped game, but very much the same thing. And I mean, yeah, I think the big fail. You die at the end of that game, and I would imagine this happens too, right? It's just sort of it's I think impossible to keep all of those systems in the air, like I was talking about, unless going back to something Janelle said really early on about economy of movement, which after she said that I realized that it's very bad. But in the first game anyway, I really got this desire that I had to make the most out of every day. Like I had to get so much cheese, and I had to do like so much. I had to, I don't know, make use of every minute that I had, because once the night comes, you can't work anymore, and then you're sort of stuck. So I think the game sort of, I don't know, languishes, but in a nice way, in this tension between progress and peacefulness, maybe, or solitude.
I think
I'm not
it
really
definitely
sure what's
goes
going
back.
on now.
Yeah, I think it definitely goes back to how time is kind of seems like a central theme in this. Whether it's action economy, like making sure you use the most of your time, or if it's just showing the passage of time as Talma is old in this game, so you kind of see the wearing of time and such. So it's kind of an interesting integral part of the game that gives it that kind of nostalgic flavor of things are slowly going down as time progresses, and it's kind of inevitable. Time is inevitable.
What do we make of what we're seeing now? Right, I don't know if you could hear it, but there were some train noises in the background. A very extended wide shot where I had no power to do anything. I could move my mouse, but nothing clicked. Now the colors are muted. And it looked like maybe smoke in the sky. I couldn't really tell, but I mean, like, like
a dust storm. Yeah.
It's almost like the game is, communicates its change of state through a change in the representation of landscape here.
Yeah.
And I maybe I rely too heavily on this idea, but I quite like it, even if I think T.S. Eliot can be an objectionable person. But the objective correlative always comes to mind when you're trying to build these sorts of relationships with complex visual and auditory symbols, right? I mean, industry here is smoke, the sound of trains, the muting of the visual tone, in a sense, a sort of tactile experience with the screen where your eyes can't see as well. And this weird silhouetted creature. I think, all these things come together.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, all of these things come together, and by generating an association, a feeling is then evoked, which is as close as one could get to the, to the actual complex feeling state of the looming impending doom, right? That's the objective correlative.
I think that makes such a great tie-in to what we sort of started with, right? And the idea of the two roles of landscape, according to Mitchell, right? One is, of course, the naturalization of the land, but then also the naturalization process of the people in it. And we sort of just saw, this manifestation of that, I think, in Talma's dream, that, she's feeling the land sort of become industrialized, and where does she fit into that? you know?
Mm-hmm.
Even though, you know, of course, the way she fits into this is completely arbitrary in a very sort of, you know, real sense.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to raise goats. We don't have to raise chickens.
But it's something, it kind of harkens back to, this is what like my family has done for generations, and I'm going to continue doing this, and kind of continuing that nostalgic sort of feel. Like, I watched my grandmother milk goats, so I'm gonna milk goats, and that kind of that carrying on of a family nostalgia tradition.
In place, particular, right?
In place.
In a place over time. And that's really interesting.
There may be like an arbitrariness to certain details, but I think the embodied experience is always that things that may seem arbitrary from a third-person perspective are intensely valuable from a first-person perspective, right? Like, I have to make sure my goats are alive.
I don't mean arbitrary.
Maybe that's arbitrary.
I don't mean arbitrary in a not important way. I mean arbitrary in it could have been otherwise. It could be.
Well, yeah, of course. There are always a preponderance of counterfactuals, right? But I'm saying that that doesn't occur.
But that's what naturalization is, right?
Right?
The process of naturalization is an erasure of that arbitrariness. Is an erasure of the thought that it could be different because this is the way we've always done it, so it has to be this way.
I think that's kind of an important point that the chapter brings up is, you know, third person versus first person, and how you're in a game environment, and that kind of is inherently naturalizing, because the game kind of goes, well, here are the rules, and play around and do the thing, and you're never really given. In most games, you're not given the space to question it. So you're put in a thing. You're like, okay, so I need to go milk the goats and get the eggs and do some farming, and you never really quite recognize, or you're just kind of like, yes, this is how it is. This is how it's going to be. I'm going to go to the well, and landscape. Murray says like landscapes in video games are inherently natural to the game environment, so players, you know, aren't forced to question it. They're just like, well, I'm here, this is my playground, I'm going to play in it.
It's tough too, because I think the games, and I think this is something that maybe Murray talked about a little bit, but I think could have been expanded more, is that games are both like obviously constructed and not at the same time. I think, and I think it's like when she was talking about the secondary representations, I think it's like kind of pointing to this a little bit, but like we know, I was doing research for another article about, and people were talking about city spaces and how like players know that a fictional city of like San Andreas, like that is a fictional city, and they know that it is a fictional city, right? But it still somehow slightly affects how people like understand the spaces around them. Right, and it encourages certain readings of spaces and around
behaviors, them. Right? Important.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like games have this weird thing where like it kind of has that same thing of the landscape where it is producing a space and naturalizing it and making it seem like it is the space. But I think it's also a little different culturally from landscape paintings, particularly in the United States, where Murray talks about how landscape paintings are meant to be like seen as like, oh, this is a beautiful recreation of this particular space. Whereas games, I think, are generally thought of, I'm making general statements here, but not as necessarily like when the game, they're not saying like, oh, this is what it would be like to homestead in a desert, right? They're not overtly thinking of that, but it's still kind of affecting in the back, you know, of their brains, for lack of a better term, about how these kinds of things work. So games are complicated in that they both denaturalize it by turning it into code, but then also kind of end up naturalizing it in other ways.
It's kind of like that psychology factor of how people experience a landscape, even if they know it's, you know, fake. They're still experiencing it through their own eyes. And
there's, you know, David, you bring up both you and David and Morgan bring up this thing. There's multiple spaces being made here, right? Like even in a game like Baba Is You, the impetus is question the rules, right? Change the rules. There's only so many ways that you can engage with that meta text. That's going on there. And the same thing is true of the higher processes that are occurring higher, you know, is this hierarchical? But higher processes that are going on in a game like this, right? Yeah, the player may be encouraged to question the rules in some places, they may not be, but ultimately their navigation of that questioning is also constructed and naturalized in a sense.
I think maybe David summed it up pretty well just a second ago when he said games are complicated.
They are indeed complicated.
That's why we're studying them.
Oh, see, this is a beautiful moment, right? She goes to this spot, and it reminds her of her father, right? So we're sort of getting that idea of, I don't know, a palimpsest maybe of time all over this one space. The ways that memories can all overlap. I don't know.
No, totally.
Oh yeah.
This makes me think actually a little bit about a piece I read by Keith Basso, I think his name is. He's an anthropologist. He was writing in the 90s, and he was doing some ethnography work with Western Apache tribes. I think it was Apache. But anyway, his book is called Wisdom Sits in Places, and he writes a lot about the ways that, well, I mean, some of the things that we talk about in Murray's, right? Just that the sort of concept of dwelling assigns, importance and meaning to lives, and the ways that people comprehend themselves.
Yeah, and that work that he did, Wisdom Sits in Places, kind of redefined how people understand place. It kind of defined landscape in a way, because he made this point of, well, a place, the spot that we're standing, the houses we own, are not just objects to the people who are living in them.
Yeah.
Like, place is equated with memories, is equated with meaning, and he kind of was like, yeah, there's meaning in these places that we might take for granted until we're not there, and then we lament that. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that gets us right back to Desartaux and place, and the idea of places being spaces in which activity, people traverse,
Mm-hmm.
I think Eric had a comment as well.
Oh, my bad. What's up?
I did. No.
Oh, I thought I heard you. Oh, no.
I can barely hear Eric. Sorry if I've been talking over you, man.
But he has been talking over me.
Well, we are almost done. It's 12:59.
It is 12:59. This has been a great hour. I honestly feel like we could go for another hour. Like, this has been great.
It has been pretty good.
I really love that chapter. It's so rich, and the whole book is so good.
I have a note to make. I think it's kind of an interesting, maybe last thing to note about games, because we're talking about games and landscapes. And I've been thinking about those footsteps that we already noted.
Yeah.
And I think that those footsteps are kind of like the physical, or at least the visual embodiment of what a game is, right? Like, you could make a landscape painting with footprints in it, right? But you can't, unless you invite the audience to destroy the painting, you can't make a painting that has the audience's footprints in it, right?
Yeah.
And so the footprints in this game, to me, they act not just as a marker of, this isn't just a landscape, it's also, you are here, right? And you are doing things here. And I think that that's a powerful way of imagining how games can change what it means to be in the audience of a landscape, whatever that means.
That's awesome.
That's great.
That's a good
Painting
parting
to game
thought, right?
convergence.
I really wanted to try to write "by" in cursive with her footprints, but it would take a while. So
the footprints are vernacular too.
But it's been great. It's been a great discussion.
I'm pretty bad at cursive. Oh, there's the grave. Okay, sorry. I'm exploring. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. This has been great, and this is the kind of thing that we like to do on Serious Play. You can catch us on twitch.tv/serious_play. We stream pretty regularly throughout the week, and we hope to see you. Join us in some chat with discussions with cool, interesting, smart folk. Any other parting thoughts?
One quick thing.
Yeah.
For those of you the conference or watching the VOD who are interested in playing this game, it is a solo project by a dev named who goes by Memory of God on Twitter, and it's published by Fellow Traveler. I understand that they're also the dev of this game is also making another game soon, so maybe that one will be something we'll play.
One last plug: you can get this game and like 600 others for $5 or whatever you choose to donate to Palestinian aid on itch.io. It's a great package, and the proceeds go to helping people in desperate need of help.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, thanks, Strong's Coffee. That's it right there.
No problem.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll edit
Bye.
this awkwardness out, maybe. No, we won't.
It'll be on the VOD.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
I can't.